The judge's voice doesn't waver. It hasn't wavered once in 40 minutes. But the courtroom has gone completely still. The kind of still where you can hear someone 2 rows back trying not to breathe. 3 boys are sitting somewhere in that building. Their mother is about to hear a number. And that number will define the rest of her life. And theirs. The number the court landed on wasn't 25. It was forever. This is the story of Kouri Richens, the Utah woman who tried to kill her husband once, failed, waited 17 days, and finished the job with poison. And the question this case leaves open, the one nobody in that courtroom could answer, is what we call it when a family survives the crime but cannot survive the verdict. Call it the double sentence. Kouri Richens was 39 years old. He coached his kids' sports teams. He ran a small business. By every account from people who knew him, neighbors, colleagues, family members who later gave victim impact statements, he was the kind of person whose absence you'd notice immediately, not eventually. Kouri Richens was his wife of more than a decade. She was, by the same accounts, charming and organized. She managed their household finances. She knew what things cost and what they were worth. The marriage was deteriorating. Kouri had reportedly discovered financial irregularities. According to prosecutors, Kouri was aware that a divorce would cost her significantly, both in terms of lifestyle and in terms of a life insurance policy worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Here's the flaw that makes this case complicated before we even get to the crime. Almost everything we know about the state of that marriage comes from one side. Kouri Richens is not alive to describe it. That absence sits at the center of this case like a weight nobody can lift, and it is the reason the defense had nothing to argue at all. Kouri Richens was not accused of a crime of passion. She was accused of a crime of calculation. And the distinction matters, because calculation requires time, and time leaves evidence. The framework prosecutors built their case around, and the one the judge returned to at sentencing, is what I'm going to call the double sentence. The idea that in this case, the punishment doesn't fall on one person. It falls on 5. Kouri's 3 sons. And the legal system is trying to protect all of them simultaneously from one decision. That tension is real. The judge named it directly from the bench. Kouri Richens didn't stop after the first attempt. She had 17 days. She knew the attempt had failed. She knew Kouri was still alive. And she tried again. The double sentence begins right there, because so does everything that follows. The mechanism of the first attempt has not been publicly detailed with forensic specificity, but court records establish that it was treated as an attempted aggravated murder, a first-degree felony, and that it failed. Kouri survived it. What happened in the 17 days between that attempt and his death is, in many ways, the heart of the prosecution's case. Because Kouri Richens did not call 911. She did not seek help. She did not leave. According to prosecutors, she used those 17 days to prepare a second method, poison. Kouri Richens died. The cause of death was determined to be poisoning. The investigation that followed would eventually lead to Kouri's arrest, a lengthy pre-trial period, and a trial that produced a unanimous jury verdict on 5 counts. Utah in the 2020s is not a place where cases like this move quickly. The state's legal system processed this case across years of motion practice. The defense attorneys at sentencing referenced years of litigation as justification for a 90-day window to file a motion for a new trial. That's not unusual language in a complex criminal case, but it is a signal of how contested every stage of these proceedings was. The B story here matters. This case emerged from a specific cultural moment in Utah where financial crimes intersected with domestic cases in ways that prosecutors had been watching for years. Insurance fraud as a motive. A spouse who controlled the household finances. A life insurance policy that paid out on death but not divorce. These aren't unique details. They form a pattern that investigators in Utah recognized almost immediately. The jury convicted unanimously. 5 counts. But here's what the verdict couldn't resolve. Kouri Richens' 3 sons were not in that jury room. And the judge, at sentencing, admitted he couldn't predict which sentence would hurt them more. The insurance fraud charges are where the double sentence framework becomes most visible, because they reveal what the prosecution argued Kouri was actually doing during those 17 days. Not grieving. Not panicking. Administering. According to the state's case, Kouri Richens had already engaged with insurance documentation in a way that suggested she anticipated Kouri's death. The forgery charge, third-degree felony, implies that a document was altered or fabricated. The 2 insurance fraud charges imply that claims were filed, or positioned to be filed, under circumstances the insurer was not given accurate information about. What this means, practically, prosecutors argued to the jury that Kouri Richens was managing paperwork and managing a death simultaneously. That's not a crime of passion. That's administration. The countdown clock on this investigation was the insurance claim itself. Once a claim hits an insurer's fraud unit, and Utah's insurance fraud investigation infrastructure has become increasingly sophisticated since the mid-2010s, the case often breaks open not from a homicide side but from the financial side. Investigators with the Utah Insurance Department work in parallel with law enforcement. The two tracks converged here. James Cope, a victim advocate who has worked Utah's domestic homicide cases for years, has noted publicly that financial control within a marriage is consistently underweighted as a warning sign. It's visible in hindsight. It almost never triggers intervention in real time. Kouri Richens said nothing publicly during the trial. Her attorney spoke for her. But the silence of the defendant in a case this heavily documented, with this much paper trail, is itself a data point. When the state has your financial records, your insurance filings, your timeline, and your toxicology, silence is not always protection. Sometimes it's the only remaining option. The plant, a source familiar with the investigation, described the forensic evidence in the Richens case as, quote, unusually complete. Unusual in these cases typically means someone left more behind than they intended to. Step back. Let that sit for a moment. The three sons appear throughout the sentencing record not as witnesses but as people the court is trying to protect from two directions at once. Their victim impact, mediated through adult family members, per court protocol, shaped the judge's thinking explicitly. He said so on the record. He named them. He described his own uncertainty about which sentence would do them more harm across the next 3 decades. That passage from the bench is remarkable. Judges don't typically narrate their own doubt. This judge did, and what he described is the structural impossibility at the center of every case where children survive the perpetrator parent. There is no sentence that fixes this. There is only a choice between two kinds of damage, delivered at different times. The judge had two options under Utah law. Both left the boys exposed. One exposed them to hope, the possibility their mother might one day be released. The other closed that door permanently. He chose the door. The double sentence became official. The insurance fraud charges are where the double sentence framework becomes most visible, up to 5 years, because they reveal what the prosecution argued Kouri was actually doing during those 17 days. 1 to 15 not grieving. Count not 2, panicking. 5 years administering. Count according 1, to the state's life case, without parole. Kouri Richens had already engaged with insurance documentation in a way that suggested she anticipated under Eric's 25 death. To life sentence. The forgery charge, with consecutive terms and current parole implies that a document was altered Kouri or fabricated. Would likely serve approximately the 2 insurance fraud charges imply that claims were filed. She would be 66, or positioned to be filed. Under circumstances, the insurer she was serves not given until she cannot be about, which the board can technically revisit under specific legal standard involving permanent that Kouri Richens was managing paperwork and managing a death standard almost never produces that's release. Not a crime of passion. He chose life without parole. Administration. And then he said the countdown that most sentencing judges don't was the insurance claim itself. He named the boys. Once a claim he described the two versions of damage. And Utah's insurance fraud investigation infrastructure in a courtroom has become increasingly sophisticated since the mid-2010s. He could not know, sitting in that chair often breaks open not from a how those young men would feel about financial decision 30 years from now. Investigators, he said his insurance every person affected by Eric Richens' death would find their way to peace. The two tracks converged. That is not boilerplate. James Cope, judges don't say that, who has worked Utah's that is a man who understood that the law had given him a binary has noted publicly that financial control within a marriage is consistently the capability translation here is essential. It's visible in hindsight. Did not act once. It almost never triggers intervention in real time. Assessed. Kouri Richens said nothing publicly during the trial. That sequence, her attorney spoke for her, evaluate, but the silence of the defendant in a case describes a willingness to cause harm that isn't erased by time or by prison. Is itself a data point. The judge's language on this when point the state has your financial records, a person convicted of those insurance filings is simply too dangerous to ever be free, and your toxicology system failure silence passage. Is not always protection. This case exposes sometimes a gap that it's the only remaining option has not fully addressed. The plant. A source familiar with the investigation described during the 17-day window between the first attempt and his death. Unusual. There is no mechanism in Utah. Unusual in these cases typically automatically flags someone left more behind than when a domestic partner has been identified as a potential threat, but no formal protection order exists. The three sons appear throughout the sentencing was apparently not known to investigate, but as people the court is trying to protect no state agency has publicly answered is whether intervention was considered between the first through adult family members And if so, protocol, why it didn't happen. Shaped the judge's thinking. That gap is not unique to Utah. He said so on the record. It exists in every state that treats attempted domestic homicide his own uncertainty charge about which sentence rather than do the more harm across the next 3 decades. The forgery charge is the detail that points directly at this failure. Judges don't typically narrate their own doubt. That touch left a record, and what he described as the structural impossibility was already at the center of every case. Financial forensics in domestic homicide cases consistently produce evidence that fixes theoretically have triggered. There is only a choice between two kinds of financial monitoring were delivered at different times. The judge had 2 options in Utah or anywhere else. Both left the boys exposed, or announced its intention to file, to hope, a motion for a new trial. Their mother might one day be released. Defense attorneys Lewis and Nestor the other cited the substantial record permanently. Years of litigation chose the door. Pre-trial motion practice became the trial official. Itself. They asked for 90 days. The court was considering the request at the conclusion of the hearing. A motion for new trial after a verdict this complete, with a record this developed, faces significant legal obstacles. But the defense's obligation to their client doesn't end at sentencing. It continues through appeal, and potentially for years beyond. The 3 boys remain. That's not a narrative device. That's the actual condition on the ground. 3 children who lost their father to a crime, and who will grow up with a mother serving life without parole. The judge named them at sentencing not because it changed the calculus, the law gave him only 2 options, but because he understood they were the permanent remainder of this equation. Kouri Richens was 39. He had coached his kids' sports teams. He had a business. He had a future that was taken from him, not in a moment of rage, but across 17 days of deliberate action. The jury found that unanimously. The judge sentenced accordingly. What the court could not give the Richens sons was an answer to the question they'll carry. What happens to a family when it survives a verdict? The double sentence, the one that falls on the boys regardless of what number the judge assigns to their mother, doesn't appear in the Utah Code. It doesn't have a section number. It doesn't have a sentencing range. It just continues. Kouri Richens will spend the rest of her natural life in the Utah State Prison unless the Board of Pardons and Parole finds, by clear and convincing evidence, that she is permanently incapable of posing a threat, a threshold almost never met. Her defense team is pursuing a motion for new trial. If that fails, the appeal follows. This case is not over in legal terms. Watch for the new trial ruling. It comes from the same Utah District Court and will almost certainly be the next major development. The loyalty pressure close. Every person who followed this case to its end watched a judge admit, out loud, that the law gave him 2 bad options and he had to pick one. Truth doesn't always arrive clean. Sometimes it arrives as a judge, folding his hands, naming 3 boys he'll never meet, and doing the only thing the law allows. Here's the question this case leaves open, and I want you to sit with it. Should Utah, and every other state, be required to have a mandatory intervention protocol when a spouse survives a first domestic homicide attempt? Because Kouri Richens was still alive for 17 days. What was being done with that time? Leave your answer below.